In history, only a few thousand men landing on a carrier deck is a challenge unlike any other in aviation. The ship is constantly moving forward to keep enough wind over the deck for the jets to land. The landing area is angled 10 degrees to the left, so that on his approach, it is always moving to the pilot's right, causing him constantly to correct for drift. The runway itself is 70 feet above the sea, so that altimeters have a built-in error. With the tailhook, he must catch one of 4 arresting cables less than 2 inches thick and only about 4 inches above the deck itself. There is a margin for error, but it is very small. If he is too low, he can slam into the stern of the ship. If he's too high, he will miss the wires and have to go around again. Too far to the right, and he will hit the fully fueled aircraft parked only inches from the landing area. Too far to the left, and he will slide into the catwalk and over the side. Too fast, and he will tear out his hook. Too slow, and he will stall and crash into the sea. A study was done during the Vietnam War. It found that naval aviators' heart rates were higher in the carrier landing pattern than they were in the middle of a bombing run into the flak and enemy missiles over Hanoi. It looks hard, and it is hard, even on sunny, calm days. But at night or in bad weather, when the deck is both pitching and heaving around in the dark, the challenge is multiplied. All of these considerations come after the pilot has completed his mission, whether it was dropping ordnance on the enemy or flying low to identify vessels in the area of the ship. The survival of dozens of ships and thousands of men and women can depend upon the professionalism of each pilot. No matter what the odds, the naval aviators must find their way. This is how it has always been. Men, and now women, of courage and professionalism against odds unknown to their land-based counterparts. The stories of their missions are told and retold, making up the heritage of naval aviation. It is a heritage which is passed on from generation to generation, which knows no national boundaries. It has been woven by aviators from every era and in every war of this century. Here are a few of their stories. In the opening days of the Second World War, naval aviation had barely left its infancy. Launched in 1939, the British carrier HMS Ark Royal was the most advanced ship of its type in the world. Neither Germany nor Italy possessed anything like it. But the Ark Royal was primarily a support ship. Existing tactics used aviation principally for scouting and defense. To make their mark, British naval aviators would have to score some important victories. Sub-Lieutenant Kenneth Pattison was one of that group of pilots on the Ark Royal who hoped to prove the value of aviation for attack. He flew a large open cockpit biplane called the Swordfish. While this aircraft could be fitted with a huge 18-foot torpedo, most early missions were for scouting. Many pilots had limited experience or training dropping torpedoes. In the first months of 1941, the new German battleship Bismarck, under construction since 1936, was nearing completion of her trials. A sixth of a mile long, 120 feet wide, carrying 8 15-inch guns and protected by 13 inches of specially hardened steel armor, the Bismarck was the symbol of a proud, resurgent German Navy. In May of 1941, British intelligence determined that this greatest of battleships had sailed from port for her first sortie in the Atlantic. The commander of the British home fleet was Admiral Tovey, a small, intense man, noted for what one colleague called his sheer, bloody obstinacy. His determination now was to find the Bismarck and sink her. Within hours, the home fleet set sail to do just that. From the south, the warships of Force H were added to the quest. One of these was the Ark Royal. On board was Sub-Lieutenant Pattison. To the north, a fleet reconnaissance aircraft sighted the Bismarck. 2 British cruisers made contact off the coast of Iceland, but the Bismarck destroyed one. After another attack by carrier planes of the home fleet, the Bismarck escaped into the open sea. For 30 hours, the British lost sight of their prey. Then, on May 26th, the Bismarck was sighted again, apparently making its way for the friendly port of Brest on the coast of France. Too far away for a sufficient force of ships to catch it in time, there was only one hope to stop the Bismarck: Navy pilots and carrier aircraft. The Ark Royal, with Force H, launched her Swordfish on a gray and stormy day. Pattison flew with them. But unbeknownst to the pilots, a fast British cruiser, the Sheffield, had been detached from their own Force H to try and find and shadow the Bismarck. In the open sea, with only the most primitive of instruments to guide them, the Swordfish pilots found a large warship near the expected location and dropped their torpedoes. They had attacked the Sheffield. Due to a combination of expert maneuvering and unpredictable fuses on the torpedoes, the Sheffield escaped damage. Upon returning, the chastened pilots conferred with their commander as their planes were rearmed. On their first run, the torpedo fuses were magnetically controlled to fire in close proximity to a metal hull. For some reason, possibly the high seas, many had exploded as they hit the choppy water. The magnetic fuses could not be trusted. Instead, the pilot said, the fuses should be set to detonate only on contact. With this important change effected, the rearmed aircraft once again rose into the gray, spray-streaked skies of the eastern Atlantic. Now, in the early hours of evening, with the aid of the Sheffield to help guide their way, 15 Swordfish headed for the elusive Bismarck. With low clouds and poor visibility, many of the pilots wondered if they could find the ship at all, but they did. The 15 aircraft broke up into subflights of 2 and 3 planes apiece and began a desperate, uncoordinated attack from all directions. In his cold, open cockpit, Kenneth Patterson could see the dim hulk from which anti-aircraft fire seemed to sprout like Vesuvius. He and his flight leader, Lieutenant Godfrey Fawcett, approached the Bismarck from behind and starboard. They dropped their torpedoes and tried to watch as they pulled up and away. Patterson thought he saw one hit. Miraculously, all the aircraft made it back safely to the Ark Royal. But as they touched down on deck, no one was certain that any damage had been done to the mighty battleship. Only later observation revealed the truth. One lone torpedo, almost surely from Patterson's flight, had found the Bismarck's rudder and rendered it inoperable. The pride of the German Navy was stuck, permanently, in a 12-degree turn. Thus crippled, the British were able to catch and engage the Bismarck in a final decisive battle. Mortally wounded, she rolled slowly over to port until completely upside down, and sank. Flying overhead was Kenneth Patterson in his Swordfish. Before she had turned completely over, he could see smoke pouring from the decks. The Bismarck's main gunnery control was a torch of fire, and Patterson found he could smell the fumes. He saw hundreds of heads bobbing in the water like turnips in a field of sheep, and regretted he had no lifeboat to drop to them. Germany's finest battleship had been more than 4 years in the making. Its operational life had lasted but 9 days.
Our century returns to combat at sea, naval aviators.
As war raged across the Pacific Ocean in 1942, this vast expanse of water became the stage for the most dramatic battles of naval aviation. Here, fast pursuit aircraft, their principal duty to protect their own squadrons of bombers, often engaged in twisting, snarling dogfights, battles which became seminal tests of both man and machine. The startling thing in those first months was not that American pilots were winning. They weren't. What they did was hold their own against incredible odds. The U.S. Navy's most advanced pursuit plane, commonly called the fighter, was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Heavy and well-armed, it was nonetheless slow and awkward compared with its adversary, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. The Zero was fast and supremely maneuverable. Graceful in flight, it proved an unshakable devil on the tail of the American aircraft. What evened the odds were the tactics created to combat the Zero by one incisive American pilot. His name was John S. Thatch.
You can't shoot anything if you can't bring your guns around to bear on it. I would ask myself, now what should we do if we're flying along in a formation? Let's say we've got 4 planes, 2 sections, and we saw an enemy. Well, if you think the enemy can outperform you, you don't turn and run, because he can catch you, and you'll be easy target. You turn toward him. Try to keep turning toward him so he can't get on your tail.
Thatch developed a system whereby a pair of fighter planes could defend each other. Previously, the standard combat configuration had been 3 planes to a flight.
I wasn't sure how well this would work, so I went out one morning and I got a hold of a young man named Butch O'Hare and gave him 4 airplanes and I took 4. It really worked.
Fellow flyer Lieutenant Edward H. Butch O'Hare went on to become a high-scoring ace in the Pacific. He was one of those pioneering young men who joined naval aviation before the war and went on to become not only a pilot, but a leader and teacher of the thousands who came after him. Alexander Vrashew, another Navy pilot, remembered the man in whose memory Chicago's O'Hare Airport was named.
He had a way of presenting a problem not only in the air by example, but by quietly explaining it in a little more detail on the ground if needs be. But you got the message rather quickly and in a way that it stuck with you. Little things like maybe conserving fuel, looking over your shoulder at the right time, or at least before making a run or making an attack. And I can safely say that I saved my life a couple of times by remembering little rules like this.
Men like John S. Thatch, Butch O'Hare, and others made the inferior aircraft of the U.S. Navy work. Thatch's earliest efforts were made before the attack on Pearl Harbor, based on intelligence reports about a Japanese super fighter. When the war began, these men helped to prepare the Navy to do the best job possible with the resources available. Meanwhile, aircraft designers and builders labored to provide new and improved aircraft. The pace of these improvements, many planned before 1942, picked up considerably once America's war had begun. The F-4F's replacement was the F-6F Hellcat, a plane that would eventually shave the perceived Japanese advantage to non-existence. But time was a critical factor. The sleek and powerful Hellcat could not enter combat until 18 months after the start of the war. It was the skills of naval aviators that filled the technology gap. June 1942. The Battle of Midway had begun. 2 squadrons of dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise were in the air, ready to attack the huge Japanese force that outnumbered them. But upon arrival at the point where the Japanese were reported to be, they found nothing. Empty ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was leading the dive bombers. In the next minutes, he would make 2 decisions and 1 educated guess. The results would change the course of the war. With no enemy in sight, McCluskey's first decision was to not waste time and fuel with a standard search pattern. Instead, he made an educated guess about where the Japanese had gone. After more miles of ocean lay behind them, the bombers found a lone Japanese destroyer steaming at high speed. Next, McCluskey chose to forego attacking the single ship and use it as an arrow, pointing the way to the main body of the enemy force. Suddenly, there they were, the largest force of enemy warships that McCluskey had ever seen in one place. Now fate would take Wade McCluskey's decisions, mix them with the history-making decisions of dozens of other men, and create in 5 minutes the most stunning success the American Navy had experienced in 7 months of war. On the decks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, thousands of feet below the American dive bombers, flight crews strained to rearm and launch their aircraft for the second attack of the day on Midway Island. In the sky, Japanese fighter planes, which should have served as cover against the dive bombers, were busy finishing off the last of an earlier attack of American torpedo planes. As each group of dive bombers lined up over their target ship and rolled into their dive, the pilots could not know that their timing, accidental as it was, approached perfection. They had caught the enemy carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Before long, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were sunk or put completely out of action. By the end of the next day, additional strikes had sunk the last one. Some 250 Japanese aircraft and many of their most experienced pilots would never fight again. Wade McCluskey had not created America's first decisive victory by himself. It came from the congruence of many factors. But it would not have happened as it did had one man not made the decisions that he made that day in June.
Our century returns to combat at sea.
Not all naval aviators were based on carriers. Some were lucky enough to spend time in places where, as they said, the runway stays in the same place you left it. But without the luxury of a moving airbase, they were sometimes required to attack distant targets. The accuracy of their navigation over vast stretches of open ocean was severely tested. Such a test was met by Tsuburu Sakai, a leading Japanese naval aviator, in August 1942. Sakai was an ace pilot. His career record at this time counted 28 victories over enemy aircraft. Since April, he had been stationed at the Japanese air base at Naval. Early one morning, word came of the massive American landing on the island of Guadalcanal, 560 miles to the south. The base commander ordered Sakai's squadron to join an emergency attack on the Americans. It was an act of desperation. Chances were that many pilots might run out of fuel on the return trip. Nevertheless, Sakai and his squadron dutifully took off in what was, up to that time, the longest fighter operation in history. The long route to Guadalcanal proved a tense trip. Sakai knew that the error of a single degree in navigation could put him off by more than 30 miles. But the squadron reached the island just as they should. And below him, Sakai saw a seemingly endless stream of American ships and landing craft. There were American aircraft, too. And without hesitation, Sakai commenced to dive on the tail of what he took to be an F-4F Wildcat. Suddenly, his cockpit was filled with enemy bullets and shattering plexiglass. Something hit Sakai, and he passed out. Sakai came to. His aircraft had fallen into an uncontrolled dive. Fighting pain and confusion, he righted his craft and assessed the situation. His cockpit was a mess of blood and shattered pieces of windscreen. Several machine gun rounds had hit him, at least one in the head, but he was conscious. Too late, he realized his intended prey had been a new TBF Avenger torpedo bomber with a rear-facing gun mount. All he could do was turn back and attempt the 560-mile trip home. Now he fought fatigue, falling asleep several times at the controls, and battled to keep his plane on an accurate heading. Every drop of fuel was essential, as on the return trip he had to detour around a severe rainstorm that might have battered his damaged aircraft to pieces. When finally he came within sight of his base, he could barely make out the runway through his shattered windscreen. Somehow he managed to lower his landing gear and flaps and guide his plane safely in. After months of recuperation, Sakai returned to fly in combat once again. His incredible tenacity and accurate flying had saved his own life and helped him survive this most brutal of wars. Fighter pilots were not the only naval aviators to meet the demands that war placed upon them. Patrol squadrons flew large, slow, long-range aircraft over vast distances to determine the presence of enemy shipping. One of the most popular patrol craft with both British and American navies was the PBY twin-engine Catalina, a seaplane that could land or take off on the water. This permitted great flexibility in base location and range for patrols. PBY crews could prove a scrappy, inventive bunch. From the beginning of the war, they strove to expand the missions of their craft. If a patrol plane could spot the enemy, why not attack him too? Innovative experiments were created. Some worked well enough to turn the lumbering PBY into an offensive aircraft. Unfortunately, this information didn't always make its way through the chain of command as it should have. When U.S. Navy Patrol Squadron VP-12 was assigned to Fleet Air Wing 17 in the Southwest Pacific in September 1943, the wing's commanding officer reported to General George Kenney. Kenney didn't believe that patrol planes could act successfully as bombers. He ordered their actions to be limited to scouting missions. He wished to use the land-based Air Corps bombers to attack any enemy shipping discovered by the PBYs. There was a lot of Japanese supply activity in the area. Often the Air Corps bombers were busy elsewhere when the PBYs called in, and the targets steamed away unmolested.
296 west by east. Roger.
The USS Half Moon was the seaplane tender for VP-12. Its captain, Commander William O'Gallery, heard the frustrations of the patrol crews. He decided to go out on a limb. He authorized what he called experimental tactics. It was now up to the crews of the aircraft to make bombers out of the slow, vulnerable PBYs. The PBY pilots used a solution of soap and lamp black to cover their aircraft and make them nearly invisible in the dark. When they took off, it was for night missions with torpedoes and bombs attached to their wings. They would attack any Japanese shipping they could find. But the targets for which they were best matched were the supply ships that brought food and bullets to Japanese soldiers stationed on islands across the wide South Pacific. The air crews of VP-12 and other squadrons assigned to the Half Moon knew that traditional high-level bombing would never work with aircraft. They resolved instead to glide in under cover of darkness and drop their payload from 50 to 150 feet above the enemy shipping.
Yes, sir, we should be in the location where that tanker was spotted earlier by a PBY-34. Roger, all crew, keep eyes peeled for enemy shipping.
Lieutenants L.M. Nelson, Jack Penfold, and others had trouble in the dark of the night. At times, they lost track of their sister PBYs in the darkness. Frequently, they couldn't actually see the enemy ships. What was visible was the white wake the ships left behind them in the water. But they pressed home their attacks. The PBY crews were successful. Badly needed supplies and reinforcements destined for Japanese-held islands were sent to the bottom of the ocean. After nearly 2 weeks of work had proven the tactics, Commander Gallery showed the results to his superiors, breathing a sigh of relief when he received their blessing. The nighttime raids that had become known as Black Cat missions became a regular part of the PBY function in the Southwest Pacific. This was an achievement not by any one man, but by a group of aviators who shared their vision of what could be done and worked out the details among each other. In so doing, the men of the PBY squadrons had shown their commanders how to take one more step on the road to victory.
Our century returns to combat at sea. Naval Aviators.
The same sort of trust and teamwork that allowed the Black Cat Raiders to prove themselves to their superiors would prove essential to another sort of renegade, Marine Corps ace Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. He was a restless young man, somewhat renowned for barroom brawling. Offered the opportunity to enter combat before the war broke out, Boyington joined an American volunteer group who flew as mercenaries for China, the famous Flying Tigers. There he entered combat for the first time, shooting down 6 enemy planes. By mid-1943, Boyington was back in the Marines on the island of Guadalcanal, and he was not seeing much action. He had a high opinion of his potential as a squadron leader, an honor he had yet to receive, and he was not happy about the situation. He let his superiors know this in loud, certain terms. As it happened, just about this time, Admiral Halsey found he had enough replacement planes on Guadalcanal to equip a badly needed additional Marine squadron. What he didn't have was a team. Normally, a squadron was formed and trained in the States and sent as a team to the Pacific to fight. Halsey did have Boyington, however, and found he could use replacement or unassigned pilots from other squadrons to make up the necessary manpower. The men were assembled, and Boyington got his command. But could a squadron formed practically overnight work together as a real team? It would be up to the self-confident former Flying Tiger to prove it. The newly formed squadron became VMF 214. They chose a name, Boyington's Bastards, to suggest their genesis. When this name was nixed for PR purposes, they settled on the Black Sheep instead. Pappy Boyington drilled the men with tactics and tips, showing an attention to precise detail and teamwork that many had thought foreign to such a well-known rowdy. The entire team consisted of 28 pilots, a flight surgeon, and an intelligence officer. They came from every corner of the United States, and now had been drilled to act with efficiency as one man. On September 16th, they entered combat. They took off that morning on what was officially their second mission. Their first flight 2 days before had been uneventful. They were a little disappointed about that. On this day, Black Sheep pilots were acting as high cover for Marine torpedo and dive bombers, attacking the strategically located island of Balao. This time, there would be plenty of action. The Black Sheep were flying at 21,000 feet, while Marine torpedo and dive bombers were at 13,000. Between the Black Sheep and the bombers, however, were additional layers of Navy Hellcats and New Zealand Warhawks. As one pilot put it, Zeros spilled out of the clouds. Some 40 or 50 of the Japanese fighters attacked the aircraft of VMF 214. Boyington wasn't the only Black Sheep member who found success in battle. Bob Alexander and the squadron's executive officer, Major Stan Bailey, played a vicious game of hide-and-seek through the clouds with superior numbers of Japanese pilots. Anderson flamed a Zero and Bailey picked up a probable. Bill Case and his wingman tangled successfully with one Zero. A few minutes later, Case found himself severely outnumbered and nosed into a steep dive to outdistance a group of 16 enemy fighters. John Berger downed too and watched as one of the pilots successfully bailed out of his flaming plane. Still other Black Sheep pilots came away with victories that would prove the skills of the squadron. Once on the tail of a Japanese, the Black Sheep pilot followed his prey into twisting turns that carried him all over the sky. When he pulled out, frequently he was unable to join up with other Allied planes. He was left to hunt for the enemy until it was time to turn home. Boynton, in his first dive, lost sight of his wingman. He was on his own for the rest of the fight, which was to last nearly 30 minutes. The battle raged, Zeros and Corsairs dueling in a series of twisting engagements. As soon as he broke off one attack, Boynton looked around for another adversary, and then minutes later, yet another. Boynton caught his last adversary low to the water. As soon as it was within his sights, he fired. He got it. But just after that, his gun seemed to seize. Pulling up, he realized how much time had passed. His fuel supply could be critically low. He turned toward home. On the ground, his crew found he had used all but 30 rounds of ammunition, and he must have taxied in on his gas fumes. For the Black Sheep as a whole, the day had ended with 11 Zeros shot down for certain, with another 9 listed as probables. The debut of VMF 214 was a success. In the following 12 weeks, the Black Sheep forged a legend that would live well beyond their operational life. And yet it ended abruptly. Boynton, soon a leading Marine ace, was finally shot down and captured by the Japanese. After the war, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. But Boynton knew he was not the only hero. He considered his weeks with VMF 214 and said, "My job was like a coach. It takes more than one guy to make a squadron. It takes everybody." The world of the naval aviator is constantly changing. World War II saw the introduction of radar and the development of the piston engine to a pinnacle of refinement and power. In the years following the war, aviators saw former frontline aircraft become obsolete in what seemed like weeks. The jet engine, a concept realized during the war by the British and the Germans, was the wave of the future. The first American jets were not far behind. Carrier-based jet aircraft entered service in the late 1940s. When war broke out in Korea, second-generation jets, including the first Grumman F-9F Panthers, were already in service. From 1951 to 1953, both jet and prop-driven aircraft were sent against ground targets from carriers off the Korean coast. Many of these missions were interdiction missions, meant to cut off supplies that came by rail and road to the North Korean and Chinese armies. Perhaps the hardest target to hit were railroad bridges. On March 2nd, 1951, a naval lieutenant flying an F-9F Panther jet discovered 2 new railroad bridges on a line just inland from the Sea of Japan. When he returned to the USS Princeton, he proposed an airstrike. The next day, Princeton's Air Group 19 set out to drop the spans. It took a second and third strike from prop-driven Sky Raiders before this was accomplished. The successful strike was led by Lieutenant Commander Harold G. Swede Carlson, flying an A-1 Sky Raider. Thereafter, the cratered landscape around the bridges was dubbed Carlson's Canyon. These initial successes did not demoralize the North Koreans, who repaired the bridges almost as fast as they were damaged. In the coming weeks, between numerous other interdiction strikes in which they spent time and blood, the men of the Princeton came back again and again to Carlson's Canyon. It became something of an obsession. Panther pilots, Corsair pilots, and Sky Raider pilots all took part in these continuing operations that spread over nearly a month. And still, with dogged determination, the bridges were rapidly repaired. Then the Air Force got into the act. B-29 bombers were sent over, seeding the bridges and the surrounding countryside with delayed action bombs to discourage future repair work. By the end of operations in Carlson's Canyon, only battered concrete piers remained, jutting a few feet up from the surface of the ground. The canyon had become the classic interdiction strike of the war, revealing the tenacity of both sides in this bitter conflict. When James Michener, then working as a correspondent, heard the story of the men at the USS Princeton in Carlson's Canyon, he decided to use it as a basis for a fictionalized novel, The Bridges at Toko Ri. As was too often the case, the precision bombing of the bridges had been successful, but the overall goal of interdiction to starve the enemy of its needed supplies was never really met. By the time the peace accords were signed, each side had solidified its position. There was no victor, and Korea remained a nation divided.
Our century returns to combat at sea.
April 20th, 1967. The USS Ticonderoga, a modified Essex-class carrier, was on station in the South China Sea. On this morning, a group of A-4 Skyhawks took off on an escort mission that would take them over heavily defended targets near Haiphong Harbor, North Vietnam. Some of the escorts would be flying what were called Iron Hand, a type of mission in which the Skyhawks were armed with Shrike anti-radiation missiles. These were designed to destroy North Vietnamese SAMs, the surface-to-air missiles and their guidance radar, now deployed by the communists in increasing numbers near designated targets in the north. Leading the three-plane Iron Hand flight was Lieutenant Commander Michael Estoshan. His job? To go in first and clear the route for the heavily laden bombers that would follow. Estoshan knew the SAMs were dangerous weapons. The tactics for defeating them required precision, steady nerve, and split-second timing. His Shrike missile worked by detecting the radar signals the SAM site used to acquire and track the American aircraft. Once the SAM's radar had been on long enough, the Shrike could memorize its position and attack the source, while the A-4 pilot jinked and turned to avoid any missile the Vietnamese fired. It was a little like facing a gunfighter on the streets of Laredo and letting him draw first. Michael Estoshan was an aggressive pilot. To his fellow aviators, he appeared to wage a personal war against the enemy SAMs. On this day, as every day, his attention was divided between his flight instruments and the electronic sensing and radar equipment in his cockpit. This allowed him to provide directions and warnings to other aircraft of active enemy radar or SAM launches on his way in. Next, he offered himself up as bait, launching one of his radar homing missiles at the resulting beam from a SAM site. The site was destroyed. Estoshan pressed on. The geography below was loaded with SAM sites. He took out a second site. Then again he heard the obnoxious buzz that told him that another site had lighted its radar and might soon fire. Up came the missile. Estoshan set a Shrike to home in on the signal. It worked, but before he could turn his Skyhawk sufficiently to avoid the Vietnamese missile, there was an explosion. His aircraft shook. There was severe damage. Estoshan pulled away and made a quick check. Another pilot might have turned back, but he chose to continue his attack. He attacked and destroyed yet a fourth SAM site before turning back. Leaving the target area, Estoshan estimated that his damaged aircraft was leaking fuel so badly that he had only 5 minutes of fuel left. Off the coast, he was aided by an airborne tanker, which stayed with him all the way back to the ship. Other pilots flew alongside to inspect his plane. It was full of holes and was leaking fuel like a sieve. Estoshin babied his damaged aircraft back to the ship with only enough fuel for a single attempt at landing. He made a precise landing. The damaged A-4 was stopped by the emergency crash barricade. The flight deck crew gathered round the wreck and examined his aircraft, while Michael Estoshin casually walked away. The word eventually came from the chagrined crew. Estoshin's Skyhawk was beyond repair. It might be called bravery or didn't make it back. For his actions on both these occasions, Michael Estoshin was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He remained the only Navy fixed-wing pilot to earn such distinction in action during the entire war. Today's naval aviators continue in the tradition of those who have come before them. In the late 20th century, aviation science has developed to a high degree of sophistication, one that increasingly depends on advanced electronics and computers. This advancement has simplified some routine jobs of the pilot, but the increasing number and variety of jobs asked of a naval aviator has created a cockpit environment that is more complex than ever. The advance of technology has placed ever greater demands on the skills of naval aviators. Precision is their watchword. The pilots have a saying: there are no timeouts in Navy flying. That is both their greatest challenge and their greatest pride. To do the job when others might turn back, they have to be more than just flyers. They have to be naval aviators.
The role of aircraft in the Navy is changing. Missiles and electronic surveillance have largely replaced bombs and bullets, but the need for highly trained naval aviators has not changed. In the recent Gulf War, the first coalition aircraft to arrive after Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded Kuwait were naval aircraft from American carriers. I'm Edward Herman for A&E. Until next time on Our Century.
To order a video cassette of this program, call now 1-800-423-1212.
Friday, brought down by a fellow mobster, Nicky Scarfo lands in prison. Get his side of the story from behind bars on an all-new Investigative Reports. Now stay tuned for First Flights, next on A&E.